Hey everybody, it's Ron, and I want to tell you a story about business and how that story changed everything. And this might be a story that you think you're aware of, but you're going to find out things you never knew. The wireless room aboard the steamship Californian is unusually quiet tonight. Most nights at sea carry a certain rhythm, engines humming and decks creaking, the constant motion of the ship cutting through the water, but tonight the ship isn't even moving, it stopped. Out in the North Atlantic, the crew had run into a pretty thick field of ice earlier in the evening, and the captain decided there was no sense pushing forward in the dark. So the engines were shut down, and the ship settled into an uneasy stillness among the ice. Inside that wireless room, the operator pulled the headphones from his ears and rubbed them for a moment. His name is Cyril Evans. Just a few minutes earlier, he had sent a message warning another ship about the ice ahead. The reply from that other ship came back almost immediately, loud enough to blast through his headphones. That message said, "Shut up, I am busy." The signal had come from the most powerful transmitter in the area, the brand new passenger liner everyone had been talking about for weeks, the RMS Titanic. Cyril shook his head, powered down the wireless set, and prepared to turn in for the night. With the ship stopped and surrounded by ice, it might actually be a quiet shift for once. Sometime later, up on the bridge, a lookout noticed something strange in the distance. It was a burst of light rising above the horizon, and then another burst of light. They were rockets being shot off. Now, the officers weren't really sure what they meant. Ships sometimes fired rockets for signaling, sometimes just for company recognition, sometimes simply to be seen in bad conditions. But somewhere beyond the darkness and the ice, another ship had just struck an iceberg, and the closest radio listening for help had just gone silent on April 14th, 1912. From Business Basics, I'm Ron Truxon. This is Business History, the daily podcast where we explain the stories that changed business forever. Every date on the calendar has a story where business reshaped the world. Today, April 14th, that story takes us to 1912, the night wireless went silent. A long time before the Titanic ever actually left port, another invention had already been reshaping life at sea. For most of the 19th century, ships crossing the Atlantic were essentially cut off from the world once they left land. Messages could travel instantly across continents through telegraph lines and even under the ocean through submarine cables, but ships themselves still operated in isolation. If something happened in the middle of the ocean, no one knew until the ship reached port. That started to change in the early 1900s when an Italian inventor named Marconi began proving that radio signals could travel through the air without wires. As a result of this, his company started building powerful transmitters on land and smaller wireless sets aboard ships, creating one of the first true communication networks for vessels at sea. A ship could send Morse code signals through the air to a coastal wireless station. Once the signal reached land, it entered the global telegraph network like always, those web of wires and cables that had already connected cities and continents. For ships crossing the North Atlantic, one of the most important of these stations stood on the rugged southeastern tip of Newfoundland at Cape Race Wireless Station. Cape Race sat almost directly along the shipping lanes between Europe and North America. As ships approached the continent, their wireless signals would reach the station's antennas on the cliffs above the Atlantic. From there, messages moved instantly through land telegraph lines to cities like New York, Boston, and Montreal, and even back to Europe. For passengers crossing the ocean, this created something entirely new. They could send telegrams from the middle of the ocean. These wireless messages quickly became a business. Passengers paid to send short telegrams called Marconiograms, which operators transmitted to coastal stations like Cape Race. The service was popular, especially as ships neared North America and passengers rushed to tell family or business partners when they would arrive. But the system had an important detail that few passengers actually understood. The wireless operators aboard ships were not actually members of the ship's crew. They were employees of the Marconi Company, contracted to run the radio equipment and transmit messages. Their work included navigation warnings and ship traffic, yes, but much of their time was spent sending the paid passenger telegrams that helped make the wireless system profitable. And because most ships only carried one operator, the system had a pretty simple limitation. When the operator went to sleep, the wireless network went silent. On the night of April 14, 1912, that quiet system would collide with one of the most famous disasters in maritime history.
My name is Teresa Barber. I was in the United States Navy, and I served overseas in the Middle East and Africa. Early on in my career, I had a commander that taught our suicide prevention training, and the very next day, he took his own life. 90% of suicide attempts involving a gun are fatal. My way of continuing my service is to help protect my community by being a responsible gun owner and by storing firearms safely. Store all your guns securely. Help stop suicide.
Brought to you by End Family Fire and the Ad Council.
Smokey the Bear.
Then you know why Smokey tells you when he sees you passing through. Remember, please be careful, it's the least that you can do.
What you desire, don't play with matches, don't play with fire.
After 80 years of learning his wildfire prevention tips, Smokey Bear lives within us all. Learn more at SmokeyBear.com, and remember,
only you can prevent wildfires.
Brought to you by the USDA Forest Service, your state forester, and the Ad Council.
A little before midnight in the North Atlantic, the brand new liner RMS Titanic struck an iceberg. Most of us are familiar with that part of the story. At first, the damage didn't look catastrophic. The crew began assessing the situation. All evening, both of the ship's two wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold McBride, had been working nonstop to try to catch up on the backlog of passengers' paid telegrams. In that system, when messages for the captain and the ship in general came in, they were quickly written down and delivered when it was convenient. A little earlier that evening, while still trying to catch up, one of the Titanic's operators got frustrated with the repeating messages about ice and simply replied, "Shut up, I am busy." Even so, he wrote the message down and vowed to get it sent along when he caught a break. But then the collision happened. And the seriousness of the collision changed the work the two operators were doing. Phillips began sending distress calls across the Atlantic. First, he sent the traditional Morse code signal, which was CQD, which stands for Come Quick, Danger. Soon after that, he also transmitted the newer international distress signal, SOS. Those signals began spreading outward through the night. Other ships heard them. One of them was the RMS Carpathia, more than 50 miles away. Its wireless operator caught the signal and rushed to alert the captain, and within minutes, Carpathia turned towards Titanic and began racing through the darkness at full speed. But you know what? The ship actually closest to the Titanic never heard the calls. Only a short distance away sat the steamship SS Californian, stopped for the night among the ice. Inside its wireless room, the radio set was silent. Cyril Evans, the operator who had warned Titanic about the ice earlier that evening, had already turned off his equipment and gone to bed. At the time, that decision wasn't unusual. Wireless operators were not required to maintain a continuous watch, and many ships simply shut down their radios overnight once routine messages were finished. It was an early communication network still learning its own rules. As I mentioned, on the bridge of the Californian, the officers did notice those rockets. They weren't sure what they meant, though. What they didn't realize was that those rockets were distress signals. And the one ship, close enough to immediately help the Titanic, had already turned their ears off.
Imagine home. The smell of coffee, the sound of a lawnmower, the sun's warmth on your face. Free to be yourself, surrounded by love that helps you grow. This is a place to call home. That's an American dream we all deserve. But in 50% of U.S. states, you could legally be denied housing if you are LGBTQ+. Get the facts and hear real stories at lovehasnolabels.com. Brought to you by Love Has No Labels and the Ad Council.
By the time the rescue ships arrived, the scale of the disaster was already clear. As we now know, more than 1,500 people died in the sinking of the RMS Titanic, making it one of the deadliest maritime disasters in history. In the days that followed, investigators in both the United States and Britain began asking a difficult question. The wireless system had worked, the distress calls had gone out, ships dozens or even 50 miles away had heard them. So why hadn't the closest ship responded? Well, part of the answer was simple. No one had required anyone to listen. In 1912, the wireless network at sea was still a young technology. Ships installed radio sets voluntarily. Operators often worked alone, and when their shift was over, as we've discussed, they just turned the equipment off and left. The sinking of the Titanic forced governments and shipping companies to rethink that system almost immediately. Wireless operators would now be required to maintain a 24-hour listening watch. Ships would carry multiple operators, so someone was always on duty. Distress signals and communication procedures would be standardized across the globe. 2 years later, those changes were written into international law through what's called the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea. It became the foundation of modern maritime safety, all of it traced back to a quiet wireless room on a ship stopped in the ice. Cyril Evans had done his job earlier that night. He had no way of knowing that only a short distance away, another ship was about to begin sending the most famous distress calls in maritime history. Calls that would help change the rules of communication at sea. And all of that happened on the night that the Titanic sunk, April 14th, 1912. I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History, the podcast that finds the turning points behind the headlines. To hear more stories like this, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen. And if you're enjoying the stories, how about subscribing and leaving a quick review? It helps more people find the story behind the business. And if you want to actually understand business without the fluff, the buzzwords, or the MBA language, start by visiting businessdailypodcast.com.